The story of the longest night in Greywich, however, is not an account of its darkest. I have met with the withered and festering shadows of ancient men so that I might unearth the deeper tales, buried far beneath the dusty fears and forgotten screams that have gone mute with time and fright-ruined memory. For the human condition, independent of a hardy curiosity, can only drink of so much distilled horror before it is impelled to reject the contents of its fear-inebriated mind altogether. The concentration of horrors I speak of began only shortly after the sheriff and his men were carried into the goblin darkness, and the townsfolk began crossing themselves as dawn approached. A book concerning these greater shadows was written long ago and resides within the wrinkled clutches of Gabriel Crow, a horse doctor and most secretive of the Greywich elders. He brought me to the grave of dead memories, and for no small donation to his practice. I was conducted to the parched depths of an old barn, well beyond the casual paths that outline the routine movements of persons traveling beyond the city. The book slept beneath a badly damaged tractor tire, wrapped in burlap and smelling of old things. Crow would not touch the book, but only gestured that I should pick it up, allowing me the solitary and awful responsibility of disturbing the sleep of devils.
Y'all might not be reading that shouldn't even be seen, but seeing that you come this far, you might as well be going the rest of the way. But be mindful, some books is just books. What you got there is a door. Once you open it, ain't no telling what might come tumbling through.
The book's author had long since been swallowed whole by the passage of time, as nothing within the mangled tome so much as hinted at a name. It was written in a hasty hand, and sounded like the written thoughts of a lunatic. Nevertheless, the author's unlikely narrative played at the edges of plausibility, perhaps not for those readers foreign to Greywich history, but to the initiated, those words hung like black smoke from a fire that had once burned worlds and now slept within the ashes of time, waiting to burn again. Even upon the very first page, horror leaked from the ancient, faded ink, as the opening of the book accounted for the days after the darkness and the madness it birthed.
Madness has become plague, for the devil has pitched and stoked cold fires into the heads and hearts of many. Great are the numbers who now perish of strain or go forth to craft murder. Most are sick with terror, for the potency of this darkest fear works frailty into the resolve of the body. Those others, smaller in number, have been cursed of God and now go cloaked and wicked, keen on black alleyways and empty buildings, where their poisoned spirits stalk their blackest desires, singing those terrible songs that once we did hear.
The days that followed this black affair were thick with suicides and madness, so much so that the church could no longer contain the flood of pale lunatics who were dying of madness. Provisionary structures were raised wide and weak to enclose those persons no longer fit for living, but who had not yet yielded to death. Soon these temples to madness became wooden mausoleums, as insanity was but the harbinger of a long and wasting death.
A season slipped from hell has descended upon us all. The air is chocked with half-dead wailing. Vermin move over our city like storm clouds and surge within it like floodwater. Naught can be done for those who scream as if to awaken our sleeping God, so that our good Lord might catch them as they tumble into hellfire. The screams have become a summons to those mad Grey Witchers who were driven into the woods. They who would use the screams to sing and kill by.
No longer able to suffer the hoarse screams of the dying, or the pestilence and plague they invited, it was quietly decided to abandon the sick and insane to the wasting houses. People even shut their ears up with wax, so as to keep the last shrieks from echoing within their already haunted recollection. It wasn't until the last days of autumn that the last feeble whimper died into a chorus of wind and cricket song, renewing the pleasant harmonies of the night in the cold silence of conscience. The following snows fell bleak and heavy upon the silent and untended shelters, washing them away in the unmoving waves of white nullity. The townsfolk looked out over the humped snowdrifts, hoping not to dream of the dark places and frozen faces that were waiting, with infinite patience, to be loosed from winter's grasp. When spring clawed its way up through the melting corpse of winter, townsfolk only wished that the death shacks would vanish with the cold, revealing yet another collective nightmare. Nevertheless, when living colors replaced the pallid snows, legions of stinking shelters rose from the death of winter like fields of crooked, wooden skeletons. For weeks the forsaken flesh and wood festered in the damp, grubby fields, and was attended only by a strange coldness that refused the spring warmth of its seasonal sway. Finally, with torches in hand, the men of Greywich drew close to the places where their fallen kinsmen had been eaten alive by madness. But before the rickety structures were set ablaze, it was realized that the shelters were entirely empty of human remains. In the places of bodies were the artifacts of a wretched industry. Dolls hewn from vulture bones, which were clad in the furs of rats, journals written down in crimson, fetid inks, veils formed from countless fly wings, eating utensils fashioned from consolidated animal bones, to assist in the eating of the spoiled flesh that once clung to the animal bones. But nothing matched the horror of what was seen hanging upon the wall of a particularly creaking shelter. An enormous portrait had been painted using the fluids of pests, depicting the occupants of the asylum. The figures, men, women, and children, were described in muted colors, and no person or thing cast a shadow, as given the lack of evidence for any candles or lamps, the portrait was likely rendered in absolute darkness. The faces of these persons were misshapen and worried with conflicting colors, but certain articles of clothing and jewelry hinted at particular departed friends and family members, and all were depicted as standing and able-bodied. Overburdened with piles of horror, the men fled from the shelters that had absorbed the madness they were built to enclose, and only when they came under the wholesome shadow of the church did the men see the tall fires burning upon the field of madhouses, fires that the men had not set. The following day, standing behind the wind and beneath the revealing light of the sun, an artifact of horror was discovered. Things that had been hidden by the darkness of the previous night and had endured beyond the flames.
We did spy many naked footsteps, drawn in mire that had been softened many nights before, when the earth drank deeply of the spring rains. It was not unforeseeable to know the path by which they traveled. They amused themselves with dark works to pass the cold and dark, and when finally winter shrank from spring, they set their feet upon the path to Devil's Clay. There can be no doubting that beneath those sagging and evil rooftops, where the devil called out to them, they are now gathered.
The last portion of the journal has trapped, by forgotten hands, dying inks and rotten parchment, a wicked memory, a sin that was repaid in the coin of everlasting spite. Now, having read the account, I have no doubt that it will rob me of too much sleep, and perhaps even revive a slumbering collective nightmare that will be nourished by fresh screams and night deaths. The unknown writer speaks of a dark anniversary, exactly 30 years after the devil-prolonged night waxed beyond the gates of morning, and how the afterbirth of that malicious occasion had been collected and redistributed within spaces that no man should ever have occasion to scream from. It seems that Gerald Fleck, a local farmer, was attempting to dig out a well. When the farmer had achieved some unknown depth, he encountered a large piece of black stone, as round and as tall as a wagon wheel. The size and shape of the stone was unique, but not as odd as the queer reliefs that were scattered about its surface. The symbols, upon inspection, were revealed to be little more than a primitive, carved depiction of a man holding a torch and crouching among a number of smaller, squat creatures. After noting the strange aspects of the stone, the farmer proceeded to break it apart with a sledgehammer for easy removal. When the first hammer blow struck against the stone, fissures shot from the point of impact and traveled to the opposite side of the stone, cracking it in half. Immediately, black, choking smoke and soul-searing screams erupted from within. The farmer scrambled from the hole as a fire rose from the ever-widening fracture. The smoke and screams reached out from the hole and climbed into the sky, and an associated stench caused the farmer to reel and empty the contents of his stomach. The fire in the stone rose higher, and the screams doubled over into choking, gasping sounds. At some point, the farmer determined that the fire was burning from the end of a short wooden torch, which was held in the right hand of a shriveled, naked man. This man was trying with failing strength to rise up from the innards of the broken stone. Pouring out all around this wretch of a man were hundreds of toads, wet with nauseating fluids and loud with an awful bleeding. When the withered man realized that he was being watched, he threw out his hands towards the farmer and opened a toothless hole for a mouth, projecting a septic flood of chortling, wet noises. The man from the rock stood for but a moment, and seemed despairing that he could not be understood, and then fell to his knees into the gathering forms of writhing amphibians. When his torch touched upon the squealing heap of toads, it ignited the foul-smelling liquids covering their bodies, calling up a fire that consumed all those who had come from the stone. After the incident had been reported to the local sheriff, an inquiry was made into the matter. While both the stone and the remains of the man who had once occupied its center were both found, the identity of the man and the manner of his incarceration and survival of both man and flame were harder facts to acquire. However, by careful examination, a small fragment of clarification emerged.
At the bottom of the wetted stone center of the rock that did give birth of both man and beast, there was found a silver ring, having apparently fallen from the shrunken finger of its most miserable host. The initials laid into its silver read E.F. I do not wonder that the man within the stone was none but Edward Fleck, subject to the awful pleasures of the devil, and who even now, departed beyond mortal dusts, has only hotter fires to comfort him.
On that very same day, another black miracle was perpetrated within a barn that belonged to a cattleman named Tobias Mumm. Around midday, Mr. Mumm heard a muted but dreadful chorus of screams emanating from somewhere near his barn. Having gone out to the barn many times and finding nothing, he decided to make use of a number of his hired hands to search for the sourceless disturbance. To the surprise and shock of all, the locus of screams was determined: the stretched belly of a cow, heavy with calf. Having encountered wickedness beyond reckoning, the cattleman summoned the town clergy, hoping that God might yet preserve the valuable livestock from the baleful powers that were known to occasionally visit Greywitch. By that evening, the animal was placed in a large tent, and the churchmen all gathered with their holy fetishes, yet few had any idea as to what they might do with them. The night seemed unusually black, and due to the particular day, many holy men and cattle handlers feared the night might overstay its welcome. Suddenly a wind rose in the field, subsequently extinguishing the blessed candles that had been positioned around the tent. Next, the screams became words, pleading with God, with unnamed mothers, and with the devil. But to whomever or whatever they pleaded, the request was the same: death. With the arrival of words, all hopes that the anomaly was the product of irregularity of natural biological courses were dashed, along with any courage that might have lingered within the breasts of the assembled men. The words seemed to aggravate the wind as it rose in sound and fury, yet its howling did nothing to diminish the volume of the misplaced voices, but rather, like a bellows working upon the strength of fire, the wind seemed to augment them, The conflation of night and nightmare continued when the winds began to twist about the tented cow, forming a gray column of angry wind that tore up the tent and flung it into the blackened sky. When the cow was made visible to the assembled men, a horrible process began. The live birthing of 20 screaming human heads.
Each head came in its turn. Some muttered indistinctly, and others sobbed and screamed, but all were open-eyed and quite awake to their plight. In the pile where they lay, thick with afterbirth, they moaned and shrieked, even gnawing upon one another in fits of terrible madness. Within minutes, the heads slowly ceased their commotion and became still with the quiet of death. And so, the 21 men who ascended into the longest darkness have returned.
The book concludes with mere conjecture.
The devil, excellent and timeless at his craft, knows more about the soul of a man than even he who might have shaped it. And just as he who mints a coin may not know its worth as well as the one who thieves it, the fallen king knows each shadow by name and may call them into his service. He gets them to that wicked city, where, in spaces lifted from hell, he keeps them. They are the unclean children of the devil, who are born not of dust, but of darkness, and to it they must return.
Journal Entry 1. With the book consumed of its worth, I allowed the hungry flames of my hearth to finish what mold had started. Crow, of course, is dead, having joined that small but growing company of wizened corpses I have left behind. And with each corpse I pile onto death's altar, the music that once contained only within my dreams now grows all the more perceptible after waking. So much so that I can almost make out the words, but not just yet. Journal Entry 2. Despite the stories and lives I've devoured, my hunger for knowledge remains unquenched, as these vanishingly small impieties will themselves be nothing but scraps of nourishment before the hungry mouth of time, to be eaten and then forgotten, and the wisdom I have rediscovered merely an incomplete song that only hints at the crooked path to Devil's Clay. Yet, there are important things I have gleaned, the distilled wisdom that transcends the sum of stories and victims that I have amassed. The way to Devil's Clay is not the snaking, nameless road that winds through the dust. The way lies through the graveyards of the soul, where the silent forms of nightmares lie unrecalled, and where black ambitions wasted of hunger. However, as the music grows louder, I am learning how to revive them, and when dead shadows bloom, even graves can become gardens. And once I have consumed enough of the forbidden fruit that shall rise from the soils of forgotten gardens, I too shall be cast from the light to walk the devil's earth. Journal Entry 3. Last night I awoke from slumber, but not from dreaming. I could feel sleep sloughing from my body like fire-blackened flesh, revealing a nightmare that endured beyond sleep. I watched as my wicked shadow was thrown upon the wall, burning black and deep into the wood. Whenever I moved, it crackled and smoked as it drew up beside me. Still, the dream diminished, and I was left renewed of weakness and wincing at the sun, casting only a weightless shadow upon the foot of my bed. But in those moments, when I was radiant with darkness, a living nightmare that cast a burning shadow, I realized much. Once I believed that the darkness was friend to evil. On this count I am wrong. It was not a foulness that overflowed me as I enjoyed the fullness of my dream, but a breathless freedom. And it was not the wan light of the moon that afforded me sight, but through an alien quality of darkness, a different light that does not fall upon the earth to reveal its particulars, but shines only to disclose its doubtful nature, and proffer a world that declines to solidify before reason's devices, and will only obliterate any efforts at knowledge beneath surging waves of molten dream. Whatever the quintessence of darkness, whether it is fixed or flowing, it has no name that it answers to. The last words I will ever write. I do not know how, but I awoke some time ago upon the nameless road. As I walked, I could weakly recall, at some distant time, standing before a great blackness. The darkness was so thick that I thought of holding my breath before plunging into it, and I feared that I might dissolve within it, and so lose myself. My body did fall away, like fleeting dream memories that cannot escape waking, and for a time I was simply all the darkness that ever was. I held, in my pitch memory, all the lands I had ever shrouded, and all the souls and smiles I had ever filled, and of course, all of the light that had ever diminished me. I remember, with pride, those times that I had struck down the light, and how many times I had swallowed its brilliant children, and most of all, I remembered how I longed for the light to return to me. I could hear the unquiet darkness within me, and at last I knew the words, and so I sang. I became the man that would have been had fallen angels crafted the world, undimmed by the hollow glories of virtue, and uncorrupted by the frigid raptures of truth. And then, the horrible loneliness and hopelessness that had always been my mortal companion fled me, and was replaced by something equally terrible, as one burden was replaced by another, the awful weight of pity. I wept for the pathetic shades who try hopelessly to force the light upon themselves, to see what light can never reveal. Then I realized what I must do. I would hunt the light-bearer. I would chase its killing light across the skies, rip free the miserable shadows from its blazing mouth, and I would stalk the halls of its bright prisons, whose many doors open into the places where dreams have won their wars against waking. Only when the corpse lights are sung to sleep and dream back into darkness will we put down our burning shadows and poison voices. Only then can this nightmare of living and dying fade into the endless dark of some nameless wonder from which we all came, and to which we should return. At last I walked the length of the nameless road, passing by the wretches who disappeared beyond doors and vast distances. I could hear the quiet shadows and their blood-coiled snakes that stirred with every small piece of forbidden fruit they had secretly indulged. I slipped past the low-house woods and into Devil's Clay. The city was offered to me as a complete thing, not an aggregation of houses, for no people ever lived here. Devil's Clay conceals only one thing, if only partially, something that lives in every house, every cellar and attic, and looks out from every window. I chose a home for myself and made my way to its rooms. Upon a desk that should never be was written a small note. It read, "Welcome home." I looked beyond my cracked window. I saw Grey Mathers walking upon the dusty road to Greywich, dragging his crooked shadow behind him.